Hello, welcome to the Charity Impact Podcast. I'm your host, Alex Blake, consultant helping charities to increase their income and impact. On the podcast, I speak to people who can share insights from their experience relating to social impact and social change. Please do let me know what you think of this episode. I'd love to know what you take away from it, what you find most interesting, anything I could do better as your host. You can leave a review on your podcast player or send me a message by email or on LinkedIn or Twitter. All details are at kedaconsulting.co.uk. I'm joined today by Derek Bardowell. Derek's a writer, executive coach, and is CEO of 10 Years' Time. He's the author of 2 books, No Win Race, which explores race and racism in modern Britain through the prism of sport, and his new book, Giving Back, reimagines philanthropy through a reparative lens, and this is something that we're going to be discussing today. Derek started his career in journalism before moving into the social sector, directing award-winning programmes for the Stephen Lawrence Charitable Trust. And for 10 years, from 2009 to 2019, Derek directed portfolios for a number of major funders, responsible for distribution of over £150 million to good causes in 34 countries. Derek's currently the chief exec of philanthropy advice and education company 10 Years' Time, which helps ambitious donors and foundations to repair harm and rebalance power by resourcing racial and economic justice with care and confidence. He's a Knowledge Equity and Churchill Fellow and a trustee of 30 Percy and Mission 44. So welcome to the podcast, Derek. How are you today?
I'm fine, thank you. Really nice to be here, and thanks for having me, Alex.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming on. Okay, so I was reading the new book, Giving Back, recently. Really interesting, really articulate a lot of interesting points in there really well. So I did realise after I invited you on, but I see you've given a lot of talks and been on podcasts and things like that. So we're going to look to cover some new ground. So I'm sure we will talk about some of the stuff in the book, but we're also going to be looking forwards and thinking about sort of future developments and what we'd like to see happen in the social change space. But before we do that, I suppose for listeners who might not be familiar with your work and with the book and things like that, shall we start off by just setting a bit of context? And I suppose the place I'd like to start is setting out the kind of the problem with the way things are at the moment, and we'll move on to more positive things. But I think we need to start off with that. Here's the issue that it needs to address and why, we don't think that things are working the way things are at the moment. Okay, just to do a bit of a sort of brief introduction around that.
Yeah, so I guess for me, that mindset shift is really crucial in not just in philanthropy, actually, in our world, in terms of, our financial systems and the way that we do things. We know that the way that our financial models and the way that the world works is destroying our planet and heavily exploiting marginalized and minoritized communities across the globe. So one of the reasons why I start with philanthropy, which has a facade of doing good, is really to do a couple of things. One, go back to its original meaning, which is love of humanity, love of humankind, and not the notion of what we see today, which is wealthy people giving to the poor, which is how people see philanthropy. And then secondly, to move that mindset from giving to giving back, because so much of our financial systems and the way that we operate is built on racial lines and built on the exploitation of Black and brown and indigenous communities across the globe. So you could look at, for example, museums in this country as a example of places that have plundered goods from the global south, plundered goods from loads of different communities across the globe, and continue to profit from these riches, and then charge people from the African diaspora to see what was rightfully theirs. So that notion of giving back really lends itself to that same notion. Why should we be paying for stuff that is rightfully ours or that has been taken from us? So that notion of giving back, I think, is really important. I think it's also important because whatever we create in the future in terms of new economic systems and ways of being cannot replicate what we've seen in the past, which is for lots of communities to be exploited in order for a very small minor percentage of people to get incredibly rich. So however we create the new, the new has to be something that is going to be regenerative and fair for all. And then I guess finally, the other notion and the other sort of key principle around giving back is around the fact that we're all interdependent, and our actions in this country affect people in other countries. So we can't have this idea that, you know, things that happen millions of miles away is completely divorced from us. You know, and we've seen that from COVID as well, that, you know, so much of the world is linked. So this idea that we have borders in the first place, let alone closing borders, is just sort of an utterly ridiculous notion. But we need a massive national conversation about these things, and a massive re-education around so many of these things, because there's so much evidence, experience around the things that I've just said, but it's not the norm for people to believe that these things are actually real.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that I found really interesting about the book is it's really about that sort of social change in the widest sense, looking at societal issues, and obviously working in the sector, we look a lot about what charities are doing and how they're funded and that kind of thing. But actually, as you say, the giving back is not just about giving some money back, but also giving back in terms of shifting power. One of the other things that came up for me was around the sort of challenge to the traditional notion of charity and the system. So thinking about the kind of charity sector, if you like, and the sort of typical ways of doing things. Shall we maybe just pick over some of what you've seen from your perspective in terms of delivering work and being involved on the funding side and those different aspects? What are the sort of challenges you've seen with that traditional model, and what are some of the alternative ways of doing things and some of the kind of positive examples, some of those kind of positive case studies that you've seen through your work and that you've shared in the book?
Yeah, so the current model is, you know, very much built on preservation. So you get paid to help people, but not really solve or really attempt to solve the problem. That's why so much of the philanthropic money, the dollars and pounds, ends up really funding services as opposed to trying to you know, address systems and, you know, systems change and systems thinking. So it becomes really a cycle that preserves the power for philanthropists, preserves the power for very, very large charities, which is not to say that they're not doing some semblance of good work, but often they're doing so by poverty pimping. So obviously by pulling the heartstrings in very negative way that dims the lights of communities. They're often doing so by appeasing the more vocal and active voices in communities with their work. Some of them are offsetting a lot of their extractive business behaviors in order to, or investment behaviors in order to be seen to be doing good. So that's the kind of current cycle that we have in philanthropy, which is a replication, obviously, of our capitalist system. Where I always go back to is that you have a number of ways of doing things in terms of philanthropy. And again, I'm going back to love of humankind, where there is a level of what I would look at as a kind of more of a cultural approach than an institutional approach. And when I say a cultural approach, it means that the way that you give, that love that you're giving, is very much based on risk and reward being really shared, and not having these levels of hierarchy where, however the giving, be it resources, ideas, etc., are based on the people that are most impacted by the issues. So they are the ones that are deciding, and where there is a level of interdependence in the way that work or those resources are distributed. And I think when you look at, you know, new funds that have emerged, like the Black Feminist Fund and Project Tallowa, which have been developed by global majority women for global majority women, you get to start to see where that cultural aspect of philanthropy, the love as well in philanthropy. The original conception of the meaning really is starting to take fruit in their practices, because the risks and reward are shared. There is a global outlook. It's not something that is restricted to, we're just going to do some funding in the UK and that's it. It's looking at how we are interdependent. There's a lot more around embodied practice. So the people that are, for want of a better word, in charge of trying to develop these funds are living and breathing a number of the issues that they're trying to solve. So what you're starting to see is, and there's been many more historically, so I'm naming those two as two recent funds that have been developed, but this has been going on for years. But you've got something now which says these are the practices that we should be looking at and we should be adopting. So that really excites me. And what excites me as well is that the Black Feminist Fund and Project Tallowa, the Dream Fund, which was run by Civic Square in Birmingham maybe about 2-3 years ago, they draw heavily on their ancestors and what communities have done for and within their communities in terms of their giving historically. So they're drawing on practices of what communities would have done in order to survive oppression, to be able to overcome things that have been problematic, and ways in which they've supported each other. They're grabbing and using and honoring those traditions and creating the new from those traditions. So that really sort of excites me. And it excites me also because so many people, when they're entering this space of, well, philanthropy is going through its identity crisis, because there's been so much critique of it in the last, historically it's always been critique, but the last 5 or 6 years has probably been more intensified, or a plethora of, articles, books and media really criticizing it. And for many people who get overwhelmed, they wonder, where do I start? What do I start with? And for me, I often come back to, you now have these places like Black Feminist Fund, like Project Tallowa. 2 years ago, we had Resourcing Racial Justice. You've got the Baobab Foundation. In America, the Imperative Fund. The Pathways Fund has just developed over here. You now have places where, if you're not quite sure, you still have to do the work to change. You now have a number of different places where, as a donor, as a foundation, you can put money into organizations that have that more specialist knowledge to be able to distribute those funds and do it in a way that perhaps your systems won't allow you to do so at this particular time. That to me is exciting, but it's also my way of saying there's not an excuse anymore to say you can't do it or you don't know, because there are so many different places now where you can support really, really good work and people that are doing it in the right way. I would also say that they are still doing it in the right way in quite traditional contexts and formats and things of that nature. So I also would say, while they are doing it really well and they are places to fund, they are also creating the new. And those organizations need to be given the runway and the space to be able to have as much space as Carnegie and Rockefeller and all of the other funders to be able to, do the things that they did, ages ago. They had the space and resource to be able to create the new. And so for me, it's not just a matter of saying, here's, I don't know, £1 million or £2 million for you to, put out a particular fund to a particular group. This is around a long-term sustained investment into those organizations so they can have the runway to create the new.
Yeah, because one of the things that we're looking at there is there's a lot of sort of traditional grant making and philanthropy happening, but doing things a lot better in terms of having people with lived experience, one sort of a better term, involved in the decision making and that type of thing, but still a funder awarding a grant to a charity or other type of organisation to deliver some work. And often, as we said before, about kind of responding to the situation as it is rather than trying to address the root causes. So I suppose there's still that need to go further, isn't there, for some of those sorts of more system change approaches. I don't know if are there some examples that you've seen that you might want to highlight in terms of some of the organisations, not the funders, but some of those organisations that are leading the way in terms of really raising the voices of people that are saying things need to change, things need to be different.
Yeah, I tell you, I get really excited by, organizations like, and organizations is the wrong word, but I'll use that shorthand, but, collective movements, innovators, however you want to deem them, like Yard, Art House in Birmingham, Healing Justice London, a fantastic, Whitney Isles Project 507, Free Black University, Contextual Safeguarding Network, Black Thrive, Liberating Knowledge, D Woods, Civic Square. There's a ton of different organizations. And the reason why...
And just to say, sorry to interrupt you, but just to say for people listening, we will put all of the links to these organizations on the webpage. So if anyone's trying to scribble down or think, or they're walking and listening and thinking, how am I going to remember these to Google them later on? We'll put them all on the webpage so you can find
I feel bad now because there's going to be so many that I'm going to be...
There will be you can never remember everyone, so then you always feel bad about the ones you...
I feel bad, but,
But it's great to see that there are lots of examples that just, kind of flow off the top of your head.
And it's not, and again, as you were talking, I remembered Rekindle and Power the Fight as well. And the reason why I always get excited by those organizations is largely because they are the ones that are creating the new. For me, they are... And I don't want to lump them into one because they're all very different in what they do. So some cover mental health, some serious youth violence, some, education, health. There's different ways that they look. Some are more academic than others. But I guess the thing that always excites me about what they're doing is that they're creating the future. They are creating a vision for the future. And when I look at the practices of, say, Healing Justice London in terms of how they are reconceptualizing what health looks like. When I think about some of the other groups that I've mentioned who are not just talking about how policing has to change, but are looking at things through the lens of what does a really protective society look like that means that the type of policing that we have is made redundant. How do we move towards, like if you speak to Dr. Carleen Furman at Contextual Safeguarding Network, and she's dealing with lots of young people, and child protection issues, which has been so much in the news recently. For me, she is redefining what child protection looks like. She's redefining what safeguarding looks like. And she comes from that perspective of how do you go from a base of protecting young people away from what we have now, which is policing and fearing young people, and how do you create the systems that enables and the society, actually it's not just the systems, it's the society that really starts to protect young people. For me, that when you hear Carleen speak, and I could never do her brilliance any justice in anything that I say, so you need to just listen to her directly. We will look back in 20 years time and we will say it was utterly ridiculous that our child protection systems, all of it, was not run in the way that Carleen is advising us to be able to be running our child protection systems. And so for me, that excites me because these are the ideas, these are the behavior and policy changes, and these organizations are the ones that are creating this, that is really the things that in years to come could and should be the standard in terms of the type of society that I think everyone, or the majority of people in this country and across the globe, wants us to be in. We want to be in a fair, a healthy society where we are liberated from the systems of oppression, where people have access to clothing, good housing, a good education system, but a good and honest education system where you know, we are at the beginning of the start line with each other. You know, there's very few people that would turn around and fundamentally say, those are horrible things. You know, if we had a society that valued our elderly, but also valued the voice of young people, that maybe started our education at the age of 7 instead of 4, and maybe we had circular classrooms because circular classrooms are better than square or rectangular ones, or that young people have the right to play and we can learn through playing instead of rigid exams from the age of, I don't know, 2 years of age and stuff. All of those things that you would look at and say, these are really beautiful, positive things that I would really like to see a society look like, you know, where our hours of work look fundamentally different, where we've got time and space to be able to give back, and where we're not spending time fearing people that live next door to us and things of that nature. It's really hard for people to conceive that because it seems so big and so massive. But I guess with the organizations that I've mentioned, what they do is they provide a snapshot, a snippet, an example of what that could look like, and what that could look like to be systemized in a very, very different way, mainstreamed in a different way, or where it is something that could spread in a way that, for example, if in 30 years' time our local authorities or education system completely breaks down because of our finances, that you have an alternative that isn't going to be pushing more kids towards just exam and based ways of attainment, but like what Rekindle conceives, which is nurturing young people, looking after their well-being, you know, giving them access to the politics that gives them a voice, prepares them for the next stage of their careers, and is not strictly based on, you know, some of the more rigid ways of how we educate young people, that legitimately prepares them for the next stages of their lives and really looks after their mental and physical well-being. So for me, that's the most beautiful thing. I've got a piece in my book, Giving Back, which is a chapter called Liberatory Visions. And it's largely because of these really fantastic, but often under-resourced organizations and people that I draw so much energy from, because I think they're doing phenomenal things. I would love for them to be running our country and our world.
Yeah.
But I know that if they were running the country and world, they would not be doing it under the current systems that that we have at the moment. And that is also really exciting. So I want to see where those guys, those people get more resources. And as I said, I come back to this. Some of it is quite simple for me. For years and years and years, incredibly rich, privileged, and quite often extractive people have been given the money and resource and time to be able to develop their theories as scientists, as data analysts, as behavioral scientists, as academics, as politicians, as journalists, to really create divisions in our world of the systems that they create. What would it look like with the philanthropic money that we have to give some of the people that I've been speaking to that level or layer of resource to be able to create the new, and to be able to reimagine our future in a way that is regenerative and is like fully reflective of the communities that are most impacted by those harms? That is a phenomenal thing that philanthropy could contribute to. And it's not going to happen in 2 years. It's not going to happen in 3 years or 4 years. But if you just had a concerted effort of funding and support to give those people and thinkers that clear runway, then you would start to see a shift in our systems.
Yeah, because I think that's the thing that's needed, isn't it? To take it from lots of those really positive examples that have achieved something, often on a small scale, and as you say, it's a kind of an example of how things can be done, and then taking that to changing the system at a wider level it's always the challenge, isn't it, in terms of how do you take that positive example and then influence the people in power, and enable that sort of larger change. And there are obviously so many aspects to how you would need to do that in terms of the political side and the media side of things, and all of that stuff.
I mean, it's not one thing, and I think that's the really important point here, is that, it's not going to be one single organization, and this is what I come back to, is that if you look at the way that our system of how organizations are resourced, it doesn't lend itself to success, because social change is not going to take 3 years. It doesn't take 3 years for something to go from conception to radical change. It takes a number of years for that to happen. So if you're funding and resourcing things that you really believe in, then you'd be doing it for 20 years, not for 3-year funding cycles. You would also be doing it on the basis of a lot more trust, which means being unrestricted with your funding, and really acknowledging that social change is very rarely clean. You don't create this wonderful, beautiful theory of change and everything just runs according to plan. No, there's so many different factors, particularly with different election cycles and different people coming in and out of power, that you have to account for. And you have to have really strong layers of trust in the people that you are supporting, because you need them to be able to navigate all of those changes. And a lot of the restrictions that funders impose on people doesn't really give them the space to be resilient enough organizationally and infrastructurally to be able to withstand a number of those really significant changes. I mean, if a government comes in and suddenly changes the rules of the game in terms of funding or how you are resourced, or they bring in a bill like the single identity bill, or the the Lobbying Act a few years ago, that fundamentally could dismantle your ability as an organization to be able to deliver the services that you're good at delivering, or create the systems of change that you need, then there needs to be some funding and resourcing that enables an organization to be resilient to those changes. And funding at even a 5-year cycle isn't sufficient to be able to help organizations on that level.
Yeah, so there needs to be a real shift, doesn't there, in terms of how grant funders and philanthropists think about the way they support this sort of change, because the traditional model is very much that we offer 3-year grants of 30k a year, 50k a year, even some of the really, really big funders.
Yeah.
The grant sizes are not sufficient to achieve that change, and when they're linked to a particular project over a set period of time, as you say, that's not creating that space and resource to really deliver change, which is going to be more of a sort of 10 to 20 year horizon, and on a larger scale. So there's, it's an interesting mind shift. But when we talk about philanthropy and we think about the individuals that are involved and that have the means to actually make that change, who could be making, the kind of 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 figure gifts over decades. There's that huge chasm, isn't there, between the way they think about their private investing for a financial return versus their philanthropic investing for a social return. So I wonder if there's a way that we can help to shift that mindset, just so that people are thinking in those terms of actually, rather than making a larger number of donations, and rather than giving it to the university I went to, or that type of thing, if they're thinking about, actually, when I invest in the next big startup and I'm placing some really big bets to, one of them is going to be the next Amazon and that kind of thing, thinking about their philanthropy in some of those terms, and thinking, actually, I need to take a risk and pick a portfolio of organizations or movements for change that are, changing the system in a way I'd like to see it changed. And maybe that's part of the challenge, is that the change wouldn't benefit them. But thinking in that different way about, making some of those kind of big bets over a long time period and really supporting those sort of movements.
Well, that's what's really interesting, because in business, people will do that.
Yeah.
People will take a punt on something, and and you see this actually a lot. So in business, you'll see a couple of things. One, you'll see that people will just back stuff and not worry too much if some of it doesn't work. So they might have a 1 in 10 or 1 in 5 success rate, because that one thing ends up being, I don't know, the next Amazon or the next big thing, which is just absolutely not the mindset whatsoever in funding. And again, I'm not passing judgment on this, but I am saying that it's not the case where you can sit back and say wholeheartedly, no one does this, this isn't, this is out of the realms of possibility to be thinking in this particular way. No, we know businesses and others will take a punt and make a big bet, and essentially say, okay, if 3 or 4 things don't work but one thing really hits it big, that's fantastic. We also know that a number of particularly right-wing philanthropists, donors and stuff have spent millions and billions of pounds to really sway our politics and to really push things in their favor that enables them to have more freedom to.
And I suppose on the flip side, they're supporting the inequity, aren't they, because they're benefiting from it in those cases.
They are. And so we know that they'll be pushing for more deregulation and minimizing social services and more tax breaks and all of those things. Again, what would it look like if, on the flip side, philanthropy, and again, this is not to say that philanthropy in its institutional form, through donor advised funds, charitable trusts and foundations, private giving, has enough money to be able to compete with the amount of money that's given away in government. But if you had more of an effort and a more of a collective effort around things that you would say are just bad, right? So our tax system and how it operates, and the fact that so many people from low socioeconomic backgrounds are going to be hit really hard because of the cost of living crisis, and have been historically anyway, but that just seems to be happening more. But then if people were fairly paying their taxes, then we wouldn't be hit so hard, and there's plenty of economists and statisticians and analysis that have done the analysis of this to say, if a certain percentage of wealthy people were paying their taxes as they should be, then that doesn't mean that the government would act in the right way in terms of their policies and stuff. But you are saying that this surely should be something that, as a philanthropy, should be punting for. But then maybe you're looking at it and saying, well, actually, a lot of these foundations, they get their tax breaks, and this is undoing their own bit. So that's where you turn around and you say, is this really serving the most marginalized communities? Because if it was to serve the most marginalized communities, then you'd probably have the majority of our big charitable trusts and foundations doing something around tax, probably doing something around land and housing, reform, and things of that nature, that essentially matters a hell of a lot to people that are not in great circumstances or facing disadvantage in this country. The absence of doing that says to me that the people that are in charge are very divorced from a lot of those issues, don't care, are ignorant to it, but they're definitely divorced from it. But you turn around and you say, well, actually, there's nothing to stop them from being able to put money into these things that matter most to the number of people in this country and, of course, across the globe. So,
and as you say, there are so many aspects to it, and sometimes that's what then stops people from doing anything, doesn't it? That they get kind of overwhelmed with it. As a bit of a thought exercise, if you yourself had a large fortune, and you can pick your number as to what that looks like, how much we need to create the change we want to see. But what would be your approach? Where do you think you would start with enabling the change that you'd like to see?
So I go back to something I said earlier, which is, I'm fortunate because I've been lucky enough to work with or spend time with, interview amazing people that are doing fantastic things across the globe. And I would just, if I had the money, I would give it to them, and just give it to them over as long a period of time as possible to do what they need to do. I wouldn't worry about what they were going to spend it on. I wouldn't worry so much on if they have a year or 2 years where they're not doing anything with the money. These are just phenomenal people that are doing phenomenal things that need the same level of resource, space, time, input, resources, and things to be able to take their ideas from conception into something that can be either mainstreamed or changed stuff or whatever, or stuff that might fizzle away. It's okay. As I said, if you look at a ton of those right-wing philanthropists in the States, they've funded tons of money to different think tanks and lobbying groups and whatevers. And I'm sure that a ton of that money has gone down the toilet, but some of it has stuck, and some of it has changed the way that people vote and other bits like that. As I said, for me, I'm really interested in, one, what are the 4 or 5 things that are key things that we should be really concentrating on? So for me, it's around reparations and where this money is liberated from our current systems and given back. I'm also interested in tax justice and what that looks like. So that might be 2 things that you might concentrate on. But fundamentally for me, I still go back to, I don't have the answers to so many of these things. And the people that I'm referring to, some of them really do have fantastic answers. Others will say, I have a hunch, but I need the resource to try. I would just give it to them and give them X amount of money and just let them get on with doing it. And as I said, it's not just third sector organizations. It will be, activist groups, it would be academics, it would be behaviorist scientists, it would be, public, officials and others. It wouldn't be just one thing. It would be those people that legitimately have an idea of how our society and how society operates can be reimagined, and what that would look like, and we just need that clear runway to be able to achieve that.
Yeah. And given that you don't have that huge fortune, I'm assuming. Yeah. What are some of the steps that you are taking at the moment? Could you maybe tell us about some of the work that you're doing, probably at 10 years' time, or some of the other things you're involved in?
Yeah, so I think first, with 10 years' time, we work with, ambitious donors and foundations to help them, repair harm and to rebalance power, and to do so by resourcing racial and economic justice with care and confidence. So we create these learning experiences and opportunities for people that have the means and resource and the will to be able to take a more reparative way in how they resource their work. And we take those learning journeys over a period of months. Some of it is educational programming, some of it is more one-to-one work, but we do so often by reducing that proximity between them as wealth holders and the communities that have the solutions and the knowledge and the power and the ideas about how some of these issues that they might be interested in, helping them take on a journey to how they reinvest differently. We want them to look at their wealth in a more holistic manner as well. So we don't divorce what their giving will be from how they've accumulated their wealth and their investments. So we take them through a learning process that enables them to really understand that and to not offset, their giving with offset and use their philanthropy as something to alleviate guilt, but to really look at this more holistically. So we do that through 10 years time. I do lots of sort of personal coaching with senior leaders that also want to, go through that particular journey. But, as with 10 years time, with the coaching that I do, it's often that space for people who might not be able to know how to manage change, or will not know what the first steps will be, really just taking them through some of the action planning steps that enables them to action things, but also giving them that safe space to be able to play out what's on their mind and where some of the knots in the mud might be for them as well. So I do that. And then, of course, with my writing and advocacy and other bits, very much speaking to people about what the reimagined future could look like. So as much as I like to critique, philanthropy, I never do so without sort of offering solutions, which is what giving back is around. It's majority of that book is very much around people that are creating change and how to resource that, or what some of the principles can be around how to resource some of that particular change. So those are sort of three ways that I sort of contribute to some of the changes that we're speaking of.
Yeah, and can I just ask, the work at 10 years time, I suppose for a lot of traditional funders, that's quite a radical change for them. So I'm just curious with that, do you have a lot of funders kind of knocking on your door, wanting to kind of go down that path, or are you out there banging on doors and trying to really make the case that they need to be doing it, and kind of is it hard going trying to get people on board with that, or is there actually a lot of appetite for it, or maybe it's somewhere in between?
Yeah, I would say there's more. So I've only been at 10 years time since May 2021. Okay. So the context in which I came in was very different to perhaps what it was before, because it was sort of post-lockdown COVID, post-George Floyd. So I think the thirst, as well as the anxiety, and it's probably on any given day for a funder, it could be anxiety there and that's another day, is really there. So we engage a lot with a lot of people, particularly next generation wealth holders or people that are new to philanthropy, because their entry point has been the last couple of years, and they're like, we don't know what to do with this, but we can feel that something is wrong. So we're speaking a lot with those, and that tends to be our main base in terms of who we work with, is high net worth individuals who probably were casual givers beforehand and have seen what's happened over the last couple of years. So we're still niche, and we're still, we as philanthropy advisors, we take a stand in terms of what we do. We are very political, we're very challenging. We do things with lots of care and confidence, but we're also really keen for people to invest differently, and to invest in racial justice, to invest in systems change, to really look at root causes. And that's why we curate and create learning experiences for people that is very bespoke, because we really want to understand what lies in their heart. We want to understand what their values are. We really want to build something that doesn't divorce, the logic that they have from what exists in their heart in terms of how they give. So it takes time, and we work on the basis that we work with people very intimately. It's very relational, in depth as well. And some people are absolutely up for it. They're absolutely up for that because they really want to do this. They don't just want to get money out. They really want to understand what these systems are, and they want to speak to different people to understand what they are. For others, it's more of I need to just get this out of my system and get some money out and alleviate the guilt straight away and stuff like that. And so with some of them, we can work with them in terms of due diligence and just say, yep, you want to get money out, we'll do the due diligence and get it to the right spaces. Others want to go through a longer learning journey. I think the second thing that I'd say add to that is, in terms of charitable trusts and foundations, we're talking to a lot of them because, I think before, no big organization wants to be seen to not know what to do. But again, in the last couple of years, there has been an element of how do we resource, from our organization's perspective, some of the things that are really, really quite huge, while also being under a level of scrutiny that charitable trusts and foundations were not under scrutiny before. So if you look at some of the big challenges that we have now, which is obviously climate, obviously it's, racial injustice, obviously it's AI and what that means for us as well, and the cost of living crisis, and how long that will go on for, and this just post-COVID lockdown melancholy as well. These are really, really huge issues. And it's not to say we haven't had huge issues in the past or historically, we always have. But I think now, unlike maybe 10, 15 years ago, where most of the charitable trusts and foundations, no one knew who they were. No one knew much about this money. There wasn't a ton of reports or books about philanthropy. You now have a different atmosphere, different conditions now, where these funders are no longer under the radar trying to tackle these big issues. And if they don't tackle them, then it doesn't really matter. It always matters, but I think more publicly now it matters because there's a higher level of account towards the work that they do. And we've seen that also with people, like 360 Giving and the grant now, just greater data, the funders for Race Equality Alliance and Civic Power Fund, civil society inquiry that Julia Unwin did a few years ago. These are all organizations, institutions, Race Equity Index as well, that are now holding funders to account. So it means that maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago, they wouldn't have been speaking to us, or they wouldn't have had that conversation. I think now, because the context has changed so drastically in terms of our world, but also the scrutiny of philanthropy, I think that's now changed.
And is it typically the sort of usual suspects of the grant making foundations that there are kind of maybe 20 or 30 that you might expect to be engaging in those conversations, or is it broader than that? Are you also getting some of those family trusts that no one's ever heard of, and there's very little known about them, and you wouldn't necessarily think they were the ones to be having those conversations?
So the ones, I mean, we work across the board. So we work with charitable trusts and foundations. We work with high net worth individuals, but also next gen high net worth individuals, self-made high net worth individuals, and corporate foundations. So we work across the board, and our client base is across the board. But I would say that, a lot of them are obscure, are not some of the, so we engage with a number of the people that are the main players, in our programs, but there are a lot of unusual suspects. There are also a few people that we've been working with who are not necessarily the coolest of the cool in terms of the work that they do, but are just really concerned and wanting to do something really, really different. And I think that, to me, is really interesting, because some of their practices are actually a lot more progressive than some of the cooler people in the way that they're doing things. So I think it's across the board, and we're, going to be launching a couple of things at 10 years time later this year, which I'll announce a bit later, that's going to address some of these particular issues that we're coming across. We've just been doing a bit of research and data gathering from the work we've been doing over the last sort of 6 to 8 months. And so we're going to kind of respond to some of that in terms of helping people navigate their way through some of the issues that they're facing with their resources.
No, great. That's all really good to hear. And definitely when you launch stuff later in the year, let me know, and I'll be sure to share and support that stuff. And in the meantime, if people that are curious as to wanting to maybe get involved with 10 years time, is there particular place to point them to? Is there a particular program or anything, or would it just be to check out the website?
Yeah, so the best thing would be to just go onto our website, which is 10yearstime.com. You'll be able to get in contact with myself or anyone else in the team about the work that we do. So it will tell you about all of the programs that we do, from, as I said, the learning journeys that we do with funders and high net worth individuals, right through to the grant givers program, which really sort of educates people that are in grant making roles. We're also partners in the 2027 Associates program that gets working class background professionals who are interested in transitioning into careers in grant making and social investment into grant making and social investment roles, and also a lot of the coaching that we do. As I said, we do sort of trustee coaching, senior leadership coaching as well. So it will outline all of the programs as well as the research that we do as well.
And for people like myself, for example, who are not philanthropists or working in grant making and that side of things, but would like to support the sort of changes that we're talking about and take some kind of actions in our own ways, you got any sort of recommendations you would make in terms of things people can do, whether they're running a charity or a member of staff at any level, or trustees, social entrepreneurs, fundraisers, whatever, or anyone in society, anyone who wants to kind of support this move to a more equitable society? What sort of tips would you give us?
Well, I mean, one, read. So, if you're interested in giving back, as I said, my book, Giving Back, but there's also a fabulous book called The Revolution Will Not Be Funded, which sort of outlines some of the issues that's in giving back. I think more broadly, from an educational perspective, a lot of the work from Sir Hilary Beckles around how Europe underdeveloped the Caribbean, and some of the roots of, sort of racial capitalism and stuff. Sir Hilary is just amazing on some of those issues. Angela Saani's books, I think she's got a new one coming out called The Patriarchs, but she's also had 2 previous books like Inferior and Superior, looking at the roots of race science, but also patriarchy. I think some of those readings for me are really important, because when I talk about some of these issues, and as I said, for many people, it's not the norm. So they have not been educated in a way that suggests that the things that I'm saying to them is real to them. So the reason I suggested some of those books in terms of where can you get your grounding from in terms of evidence, if that's what you were seeking, Angela's books, Hilary Beckles' books, those give some of really good grounding in terms of the evidence, the experiences that really are the foundations on what the work that I do and others do. Some of the foundations are there. So I would say, in terms of education, do that. The second thing I'd say is a number of the organizations that I've mentioned, find out more about their work, go on the websites, donate money to them, listen to them on a variety of podcasts. I used to have a podcast called Just Cause, which interviewed Amara Spence from Yard Art House and Imi Kaur from Civic Square and others. Listen to their conceptions of the world. You don't have to listen to mine. Ben Lindsay I interviewed from Power to Fight, and Carlene are on Just Cause. Go onto their website, listen to them speak, Google them or YouTube them, whatever it is, and hear more about what they're doing. They can articulate themselves better than I can articulate their work.
Sure.
But donate to their work, man. Find out more about what they're doing, support their work, because I think they're amazing change makers.
Yeah, I think, as you say, it's regardless of whether you've got a fortune or not, it's give that support to people who are doing good work and let them get on and do it.
Absolutely. Sometimes it's hard to find them, and it's they're not on adverts in between, I don't know, Coronation Street or whatever. So people don't know about them, or because they're not household names, they're not necessarily going to go there. But as I said, I highlight a lot of these organizations in my book. Please go out and support their work, find out more about their work.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I know the rest of my afternoon is going to be searching up all of these various organisations as I listen back to the recording. I'll get the links so that everyone else can find them as well. Certainly support some. I'd love to get a couple of introductions from you to some of those people to get on the show as well. And I know certainly we can direct people to the recordings you've done already, but would love to hear some of those voices here and carry these conversations on as well.
Brilliant.
So definitely be doing that. It's been really enjoyable. I know you've got a board meeting to dash off to, hopefully a bit of time to get a sandwich or something beforehand. Is there anything before we go, anything else that you'd like to point people towards? So I think we've got a lot of links there, but any final words?
No, there's plenty there for people to digest on.
Certainly is.
So it's all good. But thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem at all. Thank you. I'll definitely share all the links to those organisations, books, websites, everything else. Thanks, Derek. Thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure. Thanks for coming on.
Appreciate it, Alex. Take care. Have a lovely day.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Charity Impact Podcast, and thank you for listening all the way to the end. Just one more thing before you go. If you listen to the podcast, I'd love to hear what you think. You can either leave a review on Spotify, Apple, etc., or tag me in a post on LinkedIn or Twitter at AlexBlake_KEDA, or just drop me an email. For details on all episodes with notes and links to resources, head to our website, kedaconsulting.co.uk. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time, take care.